The morning sun came in low and cold across the Minnesota prairie, throwing long shadows from the fence posts that stretched east toward the creek. The shadows pointed like fingers at the small cemetery plot at the edge of the Halverson property, where a fresh wooden cross stood among the older graves, and where Maren Halverson stood with her grandchildren pressed against her sides, and her hands folded at her waist, and her eyes fixed on the name carved into the wood. Gunnar Halverson. 6 weeks. It had been 6 weeks since the men from the timber camp came up the road with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the ground. And in those 6 weeks the world had rearranged itself around the absence of one man in a way that Maren had not yet finished understanding. She was 62 years old. She had survived a great deal. She had buried her daughter 3 years before this, had taken her daughter's 2 children and made them her own, had gone on because going on was what you did when you had small people depending on you, and the alternative was not something she would consider. But Gunnar had been the one she leaned against. Ingrid was 9 years old and understood more than she should have had to understand at 9. She stood on Maren's right side with her thin shoulders straight and her dark eyes dry, because she had already cried what she had to cry in the weeks before this morning. And now she was simply present the way children sometimes are, when they have crossed into a knowledge of the world that most adults spend their lives trying to avoid. Otto was 6, and he pressed his face against Maren's hip and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement from a boy who was ordinarily incapable of silence. Maren touched each of their heads once. Then she looked at the cross. She had known Gunnar Halverson for 31 years. She had married him in a church in Duluth on a Tuesday in April, because the preacher was only available on Tuesdays, and they had not wanted to wait another week. She had followed him to this 40 acres of creek-bottom land in the valley outside Millbrook Hollow, because he had said the creek was good and the soil was possible, and together they could make something that would outlast both of them. The cabin they had built the first summer, the barn the second, the garden that had started as 10 rows and grown to 40 over the years, the fence lines that Gunnar walked every spring to check for winter damage, moving along the wire with the particular unhurried attention he gave to everything he maintained. Now the fence lines needed checking, and Gunnar was in the ground, and Maren had 2 grandchildren, and a debt she had not known about until 6 days after the funeral, when she had finally opened the drawer in the kitchen table that held the household papers. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the riders, 2 of them coming from the direction of town on the county road. Turning off at the gate to the Halverson property, Maren recognized the first rider immediately. Pemberton, who ran the general store in Millbrook Hollow, a round-faced man in his 50s, who had always been courteous to her but who would not meet her eyes now, which told her something before he had opened his mouth. He dismounted heavily the way a man dismounts when he would rather be anywhere else. The second rider did not dismount. Clifford Dawes sat on his horse at the edge of the cemetery plot, with the easy uprightness of a man who had spent 4 decades making sure he was always the tallest person in any gathering, whether or not the geography cooperated. He was 58 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a brown wool coat that had cost more than most families in the valley spent on clothing in a year. His face wore an expression she had seen before at church gatherings and town meetings, the arranged expression of a man performing concern. Behind the performance, something harder. Mrs. Halverson. Pemberton twisted his hat between his hands. I am sorry to intrude on your mourning. Then why have you? She said. She kept her voice level. She was standing at her husband's grave with her grandchildren beside her, and these men had ridden onto her property without being asked. Pemberton looked at the ground. It is about your husband's account. The store debt. Maren had found the papers 6 days after the funeral. $47 owed to Pemberton's store. Supplies for Gunner's projects over the past 2 years, lumber hardware tools he had ordered and paid toward in installments the way careful men paid for things they needed and could not afford all at once. She had known about the debt in a general way. She had not known the exact amount until she opened the drawer. "Your husband owed $47, Pemberton said. "I am sorry truly, but Mr. Dawes has purchased the debt from me." Marin looked at Clifford Dawes on his horse. He removed his hat and showed her his practiced smile. The smile of a man who had long since learned that the appearance of warmth was useful in proportion to the coldness of what he intended. "I am not unreasonable," he said. His voice was smooth, each word placed with the care of someone who had given this speech before and refined it through practice. $47 is a considerable sum for a widow with 2 young children. I understand that. I have come to offer you a way out." "What kind of way out?" she said. He gestured at the land surrounding them, the creek bottom with its good grass, the pine forest on the distant hills, the creek itself catching the morning light as it rushed over the flat stones at the bend. He gestured at all of it the way a man gestures at something he has already decided belongs to him. "I will forgive the debt entirely," he said, "and give you $30 besides, enough to start fresh somewhere. Perhaps family elsewhere." "My family is here," Marin said. She pulled Ingrid and Otto closer. Dawes smiled again. "Mrs. Halverson, be reasonable. You have 60 days to repay the debt before I can petition the court for the property. I am offering you an alternative, $30 for 40 acres. The land is difficult. The soil is poor in places. The nearest mill is 2 days away. A widow alone cannot possibly work this claim." He leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "I am being generous. Others in my position would simply wait for you to fail." Marin looked at the creek. Gunner had loved that creek. He had spent hours at the bend below the wheel frame, standing in the water in summer with his boots on the bank beside him, studying the current, measuring it somehow with his hands and his eyes and whatever calculations he kept in his head. She had thought it was the way he relaxed. She had not understood until she found his notebook that he had been working. "I will find a way," she said. Dawes laughed. It was a short sound, dismissive and certain. "With what?" "That pile of timber by the creek." He shook his head. 60 days, Mrs. Halverson. Think carefully." He turned his horse. Pemberton looked at her once before he mounted. His eyes held something she recognized as guilt. The guilt of a man who had done something that the law permitted, and his conscience did not entirely approve of. He did not apologize. He rode away. Marin stood at the cemetery gate and watched the 2 men go until the road was empty, and the sound of their horses had faded into the ordinary sounds of the morning. The wind in the grass, the water over the stones, the crows calling from the pine trees on the hill. "Grandma." Otto looked up at her. "Are we going to lose our home?" She knelt down. She took both their faces in her hands, Ingrid's serious dark eyes and Otto's worried brown ones, and she looked at them steadily. "No," she said. "We are not." She stood. She looked toward the creek where the wheel frame stood against the sky, 8 feet of shaped timber. Incomplete, the skeleton of something Gunner had been building toward for years. "Your grandfather had a plan," she said. "I am going to finish it." She did not know yet exactly how, but she knew where to start. The cabin felt different now. Marin had expected the grief to be the hardest thing. The empty chair at the table, the boots under the window, the coat on its hook by the door that still held the shape of the man who had worn it. She had prepared herself for those things, had braced for them the way you brace for a wave you can see coming. What she had not prepared for was the specific weight of being 62 years old and alone on 40 acres with 2 grandchildren and a debt, and the knowledge that the man who had known what to do next was gone. She moved through the cabin, slowly touching things without meaning to, picking up a tool and setting it down, opening a cupboard and forgetting what she had wanted from it. The children were outside. Through the window, she could see the wheel frame by the creek, its timber pale against the October sky. She went to the kitchen table. Gunnar had a drawer. Every family had a drawer like it. The place where the papers lived, the documents and receipts and notes that accumulated over a life of careful management. She had gone through most of it after the funeral, but there was one thing she had not opened yet: his notebook. She had seen him carry it for years. A leather-covered book worn soft at the corners that he took to the workshop and to the creek, and sometimes to bed making notes in the evenings in his careful block handwriting while she sat across from him with her mending. She had asked him once what was in it. He had smiled and said it was his thinking book. She had not pressed. Gunnar was a man who needed to think through things privately before he was ready to talk about them, and she had learned early in their marriage that the thinking time was not something to interrupt. She lifted it out of the drawer. The leather was warm from the drawer, as though it had been kept somewhere near a fire. She sat at the table and held it for a moment without opening it. The children were still outside. The stove had burned down to coals. The creek was audible through the window, its particular sound that had been the background of 30 years of her life on this land. She opened the notebook. The first pages were drawings. She had not known he could draw like this. Detailed, precise, the lines of a man who understood structure and proportion, who had trained his hand to put on paper exactly what his mind conceived. A water wheel 6 feet in diameter, with 8 paddles arranged at precisely calculated angles. Below the wheel, a system of gears, a shaft, millstones. The drawings had notes beside them. Figures and equations she understood only partially, because Gunnar had taught himself the mathematics of mechanics from books borrowed from the county library and from men he had worked with on the railroad before they came to the valley. She turned the pages slowly. Creek flow at the bend, 4 cubic feet per second, sufficient for 6-foot wheel at 10 rotations per minute. Gear ratio 1:5. Stone at 50 revolutions per minute. More drawings. The placement of the stones relative to the wheel. The shed that would house the grinding mechanism. The sluice gate design with a lever system that one person could operate alone. One person. He had designed it for her to operate alone. She turned another page and found the line he had written at the bottom of the final diagram, the line she would read a dozen more times in the weeks that followed, always with the same quality of feeling something between grief and gratitude that had no single name. For Marin he had written, "When this wheel turns, you will never need anyone's permission again." She sat with the notebook open on the table for a long time. Then she remembered the canvas tarp. There was a tarp behind the cabin in the tall grass along the north wall that she had noticed in passing several times over the past months, and had assumed covered either firewood or one of Gunnar's salvage projects. Pieces of equipment he collected from auctions and neighbors who were clearing out their places. She had not looked under it. It had simply been there, one of those features of a working farm that blended into the landscape of familiarity and stopped registering as significant. She went out through the back door. The grass was wet with morning dew. The tarp was green canvas tied down with rope at each corner. The rope weathered to gray. She untied the nearest corner and pulled it back. Granite. 2 circles of gray stone, massive and dense, lying flat in the tall grass. 2 feet in diameter each. Their surfaces were carved with a pattern of radiating grooves, the kind of grooves she had seen on the millstones at Halverson's mill. 2 valleys over the surface geometry designed to pull grain outward and cut it between the 2 rotating surfaces. She stood and stared at them. She had been to the Halverson mill twice in the past 3 years, once with Gunnar, and once alone, the 4-day round trip to have their wheat ground that Gunnar had always said was the most wasteful expenditure of time and energy on their operation. 2 days there, 2 days back, a full working week spent sitting in a wagon while the horse did the walking and the crop sat unharvested, or the fences went unwalked, or the 100 other tasks of a working farm accumulated in the meantime. He had been solving the problem for years. She found the bill of sale later that afternoon folded into the back pages of the notebook. 2 millstones from the Halverson estate auction held the previous February. Excellent condition, the bill said. 2-foot diameter. $8 paid in full. He had bought them 8 months ago, hidden them under the tarp, and waited for the right time to tell her. She would never know what he had been waiting for. Perhaps for the wheel frame to be finished. Perhaps for a particular morning when the light was right and the children were occupied, and he could bring her around to the back of the cabin and lift the tarp and watch her face. She would never know. But she knew this: the stones were here and the drawings were here and the wheel frame was standing at the creek. And Gunnar Halverson had spent the last year of his life building a future for her that she had not known she was being given. She sat on the ground beside the stones with her back against the cabin wall, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for 1 minute. Just one. The love in it, the planning in it, the particular patience of a man who had spent 30 years building things alongside her, and who had built this last one in secret, because he wanted the giving of it to be whole. Then she stood up and went back inside to read the drawings again. She found Bertha Lindqvist the following afternoon. Bertha was 72 years old and had been a widow for 20 of those years, and had the manner of someone who had long since finished grieving and had reorganized themselves around what remained. She lived a mile north of the Halverson property, close enough that Maren could see the smoke from her chimney on cold mornings, close enough that the 2 women had been neighbors in every meaningful sense for a decade and a half. Bertha brought soup in the first weeks after the funeral, the way she had brought soup after Maren's daughter died, and after various other difficult seasons, because she understood that food was the most honest form of sympathy available. Maren walked to her with the notebook under her arm, and her mind already organized around the question she needed to ask. Bertha opened the door and looked at her for a moment. "You found his notebook," she said. "How did you know?" "Because you are walking differently than you were yesterday. Come inside." The kitchen was warm. Bertha had coffee on and bread cooling on the table, and the specific order of her kitchen. The order of a woman who had lived alone long enough to arrange things exactly as she preferred them was itself a kind of comfort. The evidence that solitude could be managed. Maren sat at the table and opened the notebook to the first drawing. He was building a mill, she said. A water-powered grinding mill. The wheel frame is up. The stones are behind the cabin. He bought them 8 months ago. He was so close. Bertha studied the drawings. She turned the pages slowly with the focused attention she brought to anything she considered worth understanding. "Your Gunnar was a careful man," she said finally. "I do not know how to finish it. I understand the principle but not the construction. The gear system, the shaft work." She looked at Bertha. "I need someone who knows carpentry and mechanics, someone I can trust." Bertha looked at her over the table. "My grandson Arvid," she said. "He trained with a carpenter in Minneapolis, spent 2 years there. He is back now doing fence work and barn repair for anyone who will hire him. He owes me more than one favor, and more importantly, he is good at what he does. Will he come? I will tell him to come." Myron nodded. She started to say thank you. Bertha stopped her with a look. "Do not thank me yet. Tell me the rest of it first. The debt, the deadline, the whole thing." So Myron told her. The $47. Clifford Dawes on his horse at the cemetery gate, not dismounting, showing his practiced smile. The 60 days. The $30 he had offered for 40 acres. Bertha listened without interrupting. When Myron finished, the older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If you can grind grain here at your creek, you would not need to sell flour. You could sell the service, like the Halverson mill. Half their toll, 1/16 instead of 1/8, and no 4-day trip." Myron had done this calculation the night before, lying awake in the cabin, with the notebook open on the quilt beside her. Every farmer in a 10-mile radius made those mill trips 2 or 3 times a year. 4 days each. 12 days of travel time per year minimum for the grinding that every family in the valley required to eat. If she could do the same work at the creek, charging half the toll, she would have customers from the first week. She would need to earn more than $47 in 60 days, accounting for Arvid's help, accounting for materials, accounting for the time lost to construction, instead of the grinding that would pay her. The math was close, very close, but it held. "I'm going to go back and read through the rest of the notebook," she told Bertha. "There may be things I have not seen yet." He was thorough. He thought of things in advance. Bertha walked her to the door. She took Myron's hand for a moment. "Let me tell you something my mother told me. A woman who waits for permission waits forever. A woman who creates opportunity finds her own way." Myron walked back to the cabin through the dry October grass, with the wind coming down from the north, and the smell of the first cold in it. The smell of winter preparing itself at a distance. She was 62 years old, with bad knees and a 40-year-old ache across her shoulders from years of work, and a grief that was not finished with her yet. She was beginning to understand the person that Gunnar Halverson had spent a year preparing for exactly this moment. She went inside. She lit the lamp. She sat at the table and turned to the pages she had not yet read. Carefully, the pages at the back of the notebook that she had skimmed and set aside, because they looked like administrative materials, dry notations and references that she had not been ready to attend to. She read for 2 hours. In the middle of the back section, between a list of material quantities and a sketch of the sluice gate mechanism, there was a page written in a different hand than the careful engineering notes. The same handwriting, but faster. The letters less, even the pressure harder on the page. The way Gunnar wrote when he was writing something that mattered and did not want to lose it. She read the words twice before she understood fully what they meant. Dawes came again today. The third time. The third time he has ridden up to the fence line and offered to buy this land. And the third time I have told him no. He did not argue. He simply smiled and turned his horse. Before he left, he said something I keep thinking about. He said the land would come to him eventually regardless. Said it the way a man says something he has already arranged rather than something he is predicting. I do not trust the word eventually. I do not know what he means by it, or what he has done to make himself certain of it. But I know that when the wheel turns, he will understand that he was wrong about this land and about us. I am building this for many reasons. Lately, I find myself thinking the first reason is that I want this land to be strong enough that no one can take it from Myron after I'm gone. Myron sat with her hand flat on the page. He had known that Dawes was after this land, and he had built the wheel as a form of defense, a way to make the property productive enough to be inarguably viable to prove in the most concrete possible terms that 40 acres of creek-bottom land in a Minnesota valley was worth keeping. He had not told her because he had not wanted to worry her or because the threat had seemed distant enough, that the building was the answer and the warning was unnecessary. She would never know exactly why. But she knew that Gunnar Halverson had looked at Clifford Dawes and seen what she was only beginning to see, and had responded the way he responded to everything with planning and patience and careful work. The wheel was not just a mill. It was a fortress. She closed the notebook. She sat in the lamp-lit kitchen in the October evening with the creek audible outside, and the wheel frame standing silent in the dark, and the 2 sleeping children breathing softly in the back room. And she thought about what it meant to inherit not just a plan, but a purpose. 3 days later, Arvid Lindqvist arrived at the Halvorsen farm. He came in the morning riding a horse that had seen better decades, carrying a canvas tool bag and wearing the practical clothes of a man who expected to work. He was 22 years old, dark-haired with his grandmother's directness in his face, and the large, careful hands of someone who had been trained to use them precisely. He tied his horse at the fence and walked to the wheel frame without being asked, studying it from various angles before he said a word. Maren watched him from the doorway of the cabin. He crouched at the base of the frame where the shaft housing was mounted and examined the joinery. He stood and walked the perimeter of the frame, looking at the angles of the support members. He checked the mounting brackets for the shaft, with his thumb pressing and releasing. Then he walked back to where Maren was standing. "Your husband was a careful engineer," he said. "The difficult part is done. Can we finish it in time?" Arvid looked at the frame, then at the creek. He was doing his own calculations. She could see him doing them. 4 weeks, he said. Maybe 3 if we work every day. What needs doing is the paddles, the gear system, the belt, the millstone mounting. All of it is in the drawings. How do you know about the drawings? She showed him the notebook. He read the relevant pages for 15 minutes, asking her to clarify 2 things that she could not clarify and 1 thing that she could. Then he closed the notebook and handed it back to her. "The gear work is the hardest part," he said. "Cutting the teeth to the right angle. Everything else is a matter of time and labor. How many days for the gears? 4 or 5 if we do not make mistakes. Twice that if we do." "We will not make mistakes," Maren said. She said it the way Gunnar might have said it. The flat certainty of someone who had decided that a particular outcome was not available. Arvid looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his tool bag. The sound of hoofbeats on the county road came to her just after noon that first day. She was planing a board in the shed when she heard it, and something in the rhythm of it made her put down the plane before she had finished the stroke. Clifford Dawes rode up to the property line and stopped his horse. He looked at the shed where Maren was working. He looked at Arvid, who had stopped his own work and was watching from the wheel frame. He looked at the equipment spread on the ground between them, the tools and the timber, and the drawing she had pinned to the shed wall, where she could consult it while she worked. "What is this?" he said. His voice carried the old smoothness, but underneath it something she had not heard before, a note of reassessment. "My husband's project," Maren said. "I am finishing it." Dawes looked at the wheel frame, at the stones she had moved from behind the cabin, the millstones now positioned near the shed, in their intended relationship to the water channel. He looked at all of it, and his face did something she watched with interest. The thing that faces do when a prepared expectation encounters an unprepared reality. That is, he looked at the stones. That is a grinding mill. "It will be," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horse moved under him and he stilled it with a slight pressure of his knees. The automatic authority of a man accustomed to controlling things. 57 days, widow, he said. You still owe $47. Marin picked up her plane. I know what I owe Mr. Dawes, she said, and I know what I am building. He turned his horse and rode east toward his ranch without another word. Marin watched him go until he was a shape in the distance, and then not even that. Arvid had come to stand beside her. He does not understand yet, Arvid said quietly. Good, she said. She looked at the wheel frame. Let us make sure that by the time he does, it is too late for it to matter. She picked up the plane and went back to work. That evening, after the children were asleep, Marin sat at the table with the notebook and her own journal, the one she had been keeping for 2 years, and she wrote down what she understood of the gear calculations. She worked through the mathematics, slowly checking her figures against Gunnar's notes, finding the places where she was uncertain and marking them for Arvid in the morning. She worked until the lamp oil was getting low. Outside, the creek ran over the stones with its constant sound. The wheel frame stood in the dark at the bend where the water ran fastest and deepest. The millstones waited in the shed. Marin looked at the cross in the window, the faint shape of it visible against the dark, where the moonlight caught the pale wood. I know what you were doing, she said. She was not certain whether she was speaking to Gunnar, or to the land itself, or to something less nameable that she had come in the past 6 weeks to believe in more than she had before. She closed the journal. She banked the stove and went to bed. In the morning there would be work to do, and she intended to be rested for it. There were 57 days remaining. The numbers said it was possible. The drawings said it was possible. Gunnar had spent a year making it possible before she even knew she would need it to be. She slept. The paddles came first. 8 of them, each one identical to the others in dimension and weight, because Gunnar's drawings specified that any variation would cause the wheel to wobble on its shaft, and a wobbling wheel would destroy its own bearings within a season. Marin understood this the way she understood most things Gunnar had written, not from prior knowledge of mechanics, but from the careful reading of a woman who had spent 30 years watching him think, who had learned to follow his reasoning, even when the subject was new to her. 18 inches wide, 12 inches deep. Cut from the oak Gunnar had seasoned in the shed for 2 years, stacked with spacers between the boards to let the air through the wood dry to its core, the way good lumber has to be before it goes into anything that will spend its life near water. Arvid showed her the draw knife on the first morning. He demonstrated the grip, the angle of the blade, the way you read the grain of the wood before you committed to the stroke. Then he stood back and let her try. She was not graceful with it. The first stroke went wrong and took too much material from one edge. The second was better. The third was better than the second. By the end of the first morning, she understood the tool well enough to make it do approximately what she intended, which was enough. She did not need to be graceful. She needed to be accurate. Arvid carved alongside her. He was faster with the muscle memory of 2 years of training, but he matched his pace to hers, so that they finished each paddle at roughly the same time and could check them against each other as they went. This was his method. She realized the way he kept both of them from developing bad habits without anyone having to say so. Measure 3 times, he said on the 3rd morning. Cut once. She had heard the phrase before. Coming from Arvid, it was not a warning, but a reminder. The kind of thing you said to yourself at the moment before commitment, when the measurement was clear in your mind and the blade was in your hand, and the only remaining variable was your own attention. She measured 3 times. She cut once. By the end of the first week, they had 4 paddles completed. By the end of the second, All 8. Marin lined them up against the shed wall in the afternoon light and looked at them. They were not beautiful in the way that finished furniture is beautiful. They were functional objects, shaped to purpose, and the purpose was what gave them their form. But she had made them these 8 pieces of shaped oak that would turn in the current of the creek for years, perhaps for decades. And she felt for the first time in 6 weeks something that was not grief and not fear, and not the grim daily discipline of managing both. She felt proud. She did not say so. She went inside, fed the children, read to them from the book they were working through, the same book Gunnar had read to their mother when she was a child. And after they were asleep, she sat at the table and wrote in her journal, and let the feelings settle into something she could carry. Sini and Otto were changing. In the first weeks after Gunnar died, both children had moved through the days with a kind of careful fragility, as though they understood that the ground had shifted and were not yet certain where the solid places were. Otto had nightmares. Ingrid had gone quiet in a way that was different from her usual thoughtfulness, a quiet that had an edge to it, a watchfulness. But now Ingrid was coming to the work. She started by bringing water when Marin and Arvid were working at the shed, appearing at the right moment with the dipper and the bucket without being asked. Then she began holding the end of boards while Arvid made cuts, steadying the wood with her small hands and her concentrated attention. On the 9th day of construction, she asked Arvid to explain what the gear system did and why it was necessary. And Arvid explained it to her with the same directness he used with Marin, as though there were no age threshold for wanting to understand how things worked. Otto swept the shed floor. He did it with a seriousness that was almost comic in a 6-year-old moving the broom in the careful, overlapping strokes of someone who had decided that this was his contribution and intended to execute it without fault. He swept after every work session, gathering the shavings and sawdust into neat piles and carrying them in handfuls to the kindling box beside the stove. One evening, as Marin was washing the supper dishes and Otto was drying them with more concentration than the task strictly required, he asked her the question, "Grandma, why does the creek do the work for us?" She set down the pot she was washing and thought about how to answer it in a way that was true, and also something a 6-year-old could hold. "The creek is stronger than we are," she said. "Much stronger. It has been running over those stones for 1,000 years, and it will be running when our grandchildren are old. We cannot match that kind of strength, but we can put something in the creek's path that uses the strength it already has." Otto considered this, like asking someone strong to help you move something heavy. Yes, exactly like that. He dried the next plate with his usual concentration. "It is polite," he said. "We are asking nicely." Marin looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That is one way to think about it." The gear system took 5 days. Arvid had been right that it was the most technically demanding part of the construction. The wooden lantern gear, a cylinder with precisely cut pegs around its circumference, had to mesh with the crown wheel to transfer rotation from the vertical shaft of the water wheel to the horizontal spindle of the millstone. The angle of the pegs, the spacing, the diameter relationship between the two components. All of it had to be correct, with intolerances that left no room for approximation. On the first attempt, the pegs were 3 degrees off in their angle. They meshed but unevenly, producing a grinding sound that Arvid diagnosed in the first 30 seconds as certain failure within a week of operation. They cut it again. On the second attempt, the angle was right, but the spacing was slightly irregular. One gap between pegs a fraction wider than the others. Under load, this would cause the gear to lurch on every rotation. A tiny lurch that would accumulate over thousands of revolutions into stress fractures in the wood. They cut it again. On the third attempt, Maren understood what had been going wrong. She had been measuring the spacing with a rule and marking each peg position individually. The error was in the marking, not in the cutting. She built a simple jig from scrap wood, a fixed template that positioned each peg hole at the correct interval, without requiring a new measurement each time. Arvid looked at the jig. He turned it over in his hands. "This is better than measuring," he said. "It removes the variable," she said. Gunnar always looked for ways to remove the variable. The third gear meshed perfectly. The teeth engaged with a clean click that she felt through the shed floor as much as she heard it. Arvid spun the lantern gear by hand and watched the crown wheel respond, turning smoothly, the ratio exactly what Gunnar's calculations had specified, 1 to 5. The millstone would turn 5 times for every revolution of the water wheel. The mechanical advantage that turned the creek's moderate rotational force into the grinding speed the stones required. They celebrated with coffee and bread at the shed table, Maren and Arvid and both children. Ingrid asked what 1 to 5 meant, and Arvid explained gear ratios with a handful of wooden discs from the scrap pile, demonstrating the relationship physically. Until Ingrid nodded and said she understood, and Otto said he understood too. And Maren suspected one of these claims was more accurate than the other. The leather belt came from Gunnar's old work harness, triple-layered, tested by years of farm work, strong enough to transfer the rotation between shaft and spindle without slipping under load. Arvid cut it to the right length and joined the ends with the splice technique he had learned in Minneapolis, a method that distributed the stress of the joint over 6 inches of overlapping leather, rather than concentrating it at a single seam. Moving the millstones was the last challenge. Each stone weighed 400 pounds. Moving 400 pounds of granite 100 yards from the back of the cabin to the mill shed was not on its face a reasonable task for a 62-year-old woman and a 22-year-old man. Maren knew this. She had been thinking about it since the first day she lifted the tarp and saw the stones lying in the grass. She thought about it for 3 evenings before the solution came to her. Her grandfather had told her a story once when she was a child in Norway about moving a heavy millstone during a winter when the ground was frozen. The men in the story had poured water in front of the stone and slid it across the ice. She had been perhaps 7 when she heard the story and had filed it away in the way children file away facts they do not yet have a use for in some part of the mind that holds things indefinitely against the possibility that they will someday be needed. The ground was not frozen, but it could be made wet. She built a wooden sled from barn planks, low and wide with runners she greased with tallow from the kitchen. She had Ingrid and Otto carry water from the creek in buckets, pouring it in a path from the stones to the shed. She and Arvid wrestled the first stone onto the sled with a combination of leverage and persistence that took the better part of a morning. Then she pulled while Arvid guided and the stone moved, 6 inches, then a foot, then 3 feet as the wet ground under the sled reduced the friction to something manageable. Ingrid ran ahead with her bucket, pouring water on the path, the wet track gleaming in the October light. Otto ran behind with another bucket, a self-appointed backup. The stone moved with the slow, enormous dignity of something that had been waiting a long time to arrive at its purpose. It took 3 days for both stones. On the evening of the 3rd day, both millstones sat in their housing inside the shed. The bedstone fixed to its mounting, the runner stone positioned above it on the spindle that connected through the gear system to the water wheel. Maren checked the gap between the stones, adjusted it twice against Gunnar's specified measurement, and checked it again. She stood back and looked at what they had built. The shed was small and functional, and every part of it had been thought through carefully before it was made. The wheel stood at the creek's bend where the water ran fastest. The shaft entered the shed through a sealed bearing housing that Arvid had fitted with practiced hands. The gears waited in their housing. The belt connected shaft to spindle in a taut loop that would carry the creek's rotation to the stones. It was day 37. They had built it in 33 days. Agnes Lindqvist arrived the following morning with 3 sacks of wheat in her wagon. Her husband driving and his face wearing the particular expression of a man who has agreed to something his wife proposed and is not yet certain whether it was a good idea. He had been a cautious man all his life. It had served him in most situations. He had not been wrong often enough to have learned the specific lesson that caution has a cost, which is that you sometimes arrive too late for the things that require a prior commitment. Bertha had no such difficulty. She climbed down from the wagon with the briskness of a woman who has made her decision and is done with the deliberating. "Show us," she said. Maren led them to the mill shed. She showed them the wheel, the shaft, the gears, the stones. Bertha's husband walked around the structure twice, pressing joints with his thumb. Looking up at the wheel from below the professional inspection of a man who had built things and knew what built things were supposed to look like. He said nothing. His face remained careful. "Are you ready?" Arvid asked. Maren looked at the wheel at the closed sluice gate that held back the creek's flow at the lever she had spent an afternoon adjusting until she was certain it would move smoothly under her hand. She pulled the lever. The gate opened. Water rushed through the channel in a sound like the creek had been waiting for this release. A sound both familiar and entirely new. The creek's constant voice suddenly given direction and purpose. The water struck the first paddle of the wheel with a force she felt through the shed floor. A low impact that traveled up through the soles of her feet. The wheel groaned once the long complaint of timber taking load for the first time. And then it began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster as the paddles caught the full flow. The shaft rotated. The gears engaged with the clicking sound she had heard when they tested them by hand, but amplified now, given weight by the actual load. The sound of the system doing the work it had been built to do. The belt pulled taut with a snap. The runner stone began to move, rotating above the fixed bedstone in the deliberate circle that would continue as long as the creek ran. "Pour in the grain," Maren said. Bertha lifted a scoop of wheat from the sack and fed it into the wooden hopper above the stones. The grain cascaded down through the eye of the runner stone, falling into the gap between the 2 granite surfaces where the grooves would catch it and cut it and work it outward toward the collection trough. They waited. 20 minutes. The shed filled with the smell of fresh grain. A warm, dusty smell. That was the smell of bread. Before it was bread, the smell of winter provisions being secured. Maren watched the collection trough beneath the stones. Then the flour came. A thin stream at first, then steadier, golden and fine as silk, pouring from between the stones into the trough below in a continuous flow that gathered into a soft pile of milled wheat, lighter and finer than anything the Halverson mill had ever produced, because these stones had been dressed by the man who bought them with the specific flow rate of this specific creek in mind, and the fit was perfect. Bertha Lindqvist covered her mouth with both hands. Her husband stopped being careful. He stood in the shed with the flour on his fingers where he had reached out to test the texture, and his face finally said the thing it had been unwilling to commit to all morning. "It works," he said. "It truly works." Bertha said nothing. She was crying without making any sound the way old women sometimes cry when something is too much for the ordinary expression of feeling, when the emotion is larger than the throat can accommodate. Word moved through the valley the way water moves through dry ground faster than you expect, and touching everything. Within a week, 3 more families brought grain. Then 5. Then 8. They came in the mornings, mostly on the county road, their wagons loaded with sacks, and Maren greeted each one at the mill shed, and explained the fee, 1/16 of the grain ground, half the Halverson toll, and watched their faces do the math. No 4-day trip, one farmer said. He kept saying it as though repetition might make it fully real. No 4-day trip. Ingrid managed the hopper with growing confidence, learning to adjust the feed rate for different grain types, wheat versus rye versus corn, each requiring a slightly different approach to the gap between the stones. Arvid had shown her how to read the sound of the grinding, the pitch that told you the gap was right, and the different pitch that told you it needed adjustment. She learned quickly with the focused attention of a child who has found a thing she is good at and understands it. Otto swept. He swept with the commitment of a person whose contribution to a large enterprise is exactly this specific task, and who has decided that the specific task will be executed without fault. On day 42, Maren counted her earnings. $12 in coin, plus 60 pounds of grain as toll stored in the cellar, in sacks she had labeled with dates and contents in her neat handwriting. 26 more days remained. She needed $47. At her current rate of business, accounting for the 3 Sundays in the remaining period when she would not operate, she would reach the necessary amount on approximately day 58. 2 days before the deadline. No margin. The same zero margin situation she had been managing since the beginning, the mathematics of survival, conducted at the exact edge of what was sufficient. But it was sufficient. The numbers said so. On the morning of day 47, Maren was adjusting the sluice gate lever when she heard the hoofbeats. She knew before she looked. Sheriff Pruitt came up the path with his hat on, and his face carrying the expression she had come to associate with men who were doing things the law required of them that their own judgment did not entirely endorse. Clifford Dawes rode behind him. He was not wearing his practiced smile today. He was wearing instead the flat expression of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at a result he considers satisfactory. Pruitt dismounted. He had a folded paper in his hand. Mrs. Halverson. His voice was the professional voice, the one that meant he was reading from a script he had not written. I have a court order here. Mr. Dawes has filed a complaint under Minnesota Territorial Statute. Commercial milling requires a permit. The permit must be signed by a property owner free of outstanding debt. He held out the paper. She took it. She read it. Cease and desist. She had until sundown to close the mill shed and stop all grinding operations. The water wheel could remain standing. The stones could remain in their housing. But the sluice gate was to stay closed until the debt was resolved or the permit obtained. Dawes had not filed this complaint because the law required him to. He had filed it because he had watched her business growing for 9 days and had understood what the trajectory meant. Another 20 days at this rate, and she would have her $47. The cease and desist was not about the permit. It was about the timing. Did you think you could outsmart me, Mrs. Halverson? He said. His voice had dropped the warmth entirely now, the performance packed away. Sell me the land. $40. I am still being generous. Or lose everything in 13 days. He mounted his horse and rode east. Pruitt looked at her. He was a fair man in the way that men become fair when they have seen enough unfairness to know its costs. But fair men who work within the law are constrained by the law. And the law said what it said. I am sorry, he said. He rode away. Maren stood in front of the mill shed with the paper in her hand. The sluice gate was closed. The wheel was still. The creek ran past the paddles with its indifferent energy. The same energy it would have whether the wheel was turning or standing, the energy that did not care about cease and desist orders or creditors or the mathematics of 60 days. She read the paper again. Then she went inside the cabin. She sat at the table. Ingrid and Otto were still at school, the small county school 2 miles up the road that Maren had decided they would attend every day, regardless of what else was happening. Because Gunnar had believed in the school, and she believed in what he had believed in. She was alone. She looked at the window. Through it, she could see the still wheel, its paddles motionless above the running water. And it was the most painful thing she had looked at since the wooden cross in the cemetery plot. Because the wheel represented not just the money she needed, but the thing Gunnar had spent a year building toward. The thing she had spent 33 days finishing with blistered hands, the thing that had worked exactly as the drawing said. It would work, and now it was standing still because a man who wanted her land had found a lever to pull. She felt for the first time in 47 days the specific weight of defeat. Not panic. She had a character that did not panic. But defeat is different from panic. Panic is the fear that something might go wrong. Defeat is the recognition that something has gone wrong and that the paths forward have narrowed to a point. She sat with the feeling for a long time. She thought about Gunnar's $30. It was enough for a room somewhere. Enough to get through the winter while she found work. She was 62, but she was not infirm. She could keep house. She could teach. She had taught school for 3 years before she married Gunnar, and she had not forgotten how. She thought about Ingrid adjusting the hopper feed with her practiced 9-year-old hands. She thought about Otto sweeping the shed floor with his careful broom strokes. She thought about the line Gunnar had written at the bottom of the drawing. When this wheel turns, you will never need anyone's permission again. She got up. She went to the notebook. She turned to the back pages, the administrative section she had read quickly and set aside. And she read it again now with the specific attention of someone looking for something she might have missed. She read every page. She read the material lists and the measurement tables and the notes on creek flow variation by season. And then between a sketch of the sluice gate mechanism and a list of tool requirements, she found the page. Gunnar had copied it in his careful block handwriting, a full page of text from what she recognized as a legal document, the format and phrasing of official language that she had seen in other contexts. Below the copied text, he had drawn a box around one paragraph and filled the box with red ink, the color he used when he wanted something to be impossible to overlook. She read the paragraph. Then she read it again. A widow of a homesteader who has made improvements to the claim and demonstrated the ability to work the land may petition for continued residency, pending debt resolution. Such petition requires sworn testimony of witnesses to improvements made and the viability of the claim as a working property. She put her hand flat on the page. Witnesses, the neighbors whose grain she had ground, the families who had watched the wheelwork, who had tasted the flour it produced, who had calculated what the 4-day trip to Halverson had cost them over the years and what its absence was worth. She needed them to say what they knew. She needed to ask them. The thought came with a kind of clarity that felt like the clarity she had felt when she understood the jig for the gear template, the simplification of a problem that had seemed to require many separate operations into a single, elegant action. She did not need to find a lawyer. She did not need to find money she did not have. She needed the people she had been serving for 9 days to stand in front of a judge and say what was true. She knew what was true. The question was whether she could bring herself to ask for what she needed. She had been raised in a tradition that made asking for help a last resort, that valued self-sufficiency, the way some traditions value faith as a fundamental measure of character. She had been Gunnar's partner in this for 30 years. and the partnership had been built on the principle that you solved your own problems before you presented them to anyone else. She had been operating that way for 47 days, and she intended to keep operating that way. But asking people to testify to what they had witnessed was not asking for charity. It was asking people to do something they were capable of doing, and that cost them nothing except time and the willingness to say in a public setting what they already knew to be true. That was different. She closed the notebook. She went to the shed and got her horse. She would start with Bertha, not because she needed Bertha's encouragement, but because Bertha had been through this kind of thing in a different form 20 years ago, and she had come out the other side, and she would know the right words for what Marin was going to do, which was ride to every farm within 10 miles and ask each family the same 2 questions. Have I served you? Will you say so? She mounted the horse with the stiffness that had settled into her hips over the past 33 days of physical work, the honest stiffness of a body that had done more than it was accustomed to doing, and had not complained during the doing but was making its accounting now. She adjusted her seat. She looked at the still wheel one more time. Then she rode north toward Bertha Lindqvist's farm. The road was empty in the late afternoon. The October light came in low and golden across the harvested fields, the kind of light that makes the ordinary landscape look as though it has been given permission to be beautiful for 1 hour. Before the dark comes, Marin rode through it without looking at it, her mind on what she would say, and in what order and how she would make it plain that she was not asking anyone to stretch the truth or to say anything they did not believe. She was asking them to say what they knew. The creek ran parallel to the road for half a mile before it turned away toward the south. She could hear it, even hear the same sound she had listened to for 30 years from her kitchen window. It had been running when she arrived on this land as a young woman with a husband who had a plan for it. It had been running when her daughter was born on a February morning and Gunnar had gone out to the creek afterward and stood there for a long time in the snow. It had been running through all the days since, constant and indifferent and full of the energy that did not know. It had been put to a purpose but moved through the wheel's paddles just as readily as it moved over the stones. It had been moving over for 1,000 years. Bertha was in her garden when Marin rode up. She looked at Marin's face. She put down her trowel. "Come inside," she said. Bertha Lindqvist's kitchen was warm in the way that certain kitchens are warm, not just from the stove, but from the accumulated warmth of years of use of meals prepared and eaten, and conversations held, and problems worked through at the same table over the same cups. Marin sat across from Bertha and told her everything. The cease and desist order, the Homestead Act provision Gunnar had copied and boxed in red ink, the witnesses she needed, the 13 days remaining. Bertha listened without interrupting. When Marin finished, the older woman was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window. Then she looked back at Marin with the expression she wore when she had already made a decision and was simply organizing the execution of it. "How many families did you grind for?" she said. "8 so far," Marin said. "Perhaps more would come if the mill were still running." "8 is enough to start," Bertha said. "And there are others who would come if they were asked. Families that had been meaning to make the trip, but had not gotten around to it." She stood. "You will ride to the farms south of the creek. I will ride to the farms north. We will tell them what is happening and what is needed, and we will let them decide." Marin looked at her. "I want to do this myself." Bertha paused. "You are," Marin said. "This is my land, my husband's wheel, my petition. I need to be the one who asks." Bertha sat back down. She considered this. Then she nodded. "Tell me where you want to start," she said, "and I will stay here and make sure the coffee is hot when you come back tonight." Marin rode for 6 days. She rode in the mornings and the afternoons, and sometimes into the early evenings, when the light was still enough and the road was still passable. She rode to farms she had visited before for neighborly purposes, and to farms she had only seen from the road, and to 2 farms she had never been to at all, where she dismounted at the gate and knocked and waited and explained herself to people who had to look at her twice before they placed her face. She did not ask them for sympathy. She did not describe Clifford Dawes in the terms she privately used. She did not talk about what losing the land would mean for Ingrid and Otto. Though she thought about it every hour, she asked 2 questions. "Did I grind your grain? Will you say so before a judge?" The first question had a factual answer. Either she had ground their grain or she had not. The second question was a matter of choice, and she let them make it without pressure, without the performance of need that might have produced a yes she could not rely on. Most of them said yes on the same day she asked. A few asked a day to think about it, and sent word the following morning. One family, the Andersons from the North Valley, said they had not used her mill, but they had heard about it, and they would come anyway to say what they had heard, because hearsay from a neighbor about the quality of a woman's work was its own kind of testimony. On the evening of the 6th day of riding, Marin sat at her kitchen table and counted 14 families, 41 people. She wrote each name in her journal in her careful handwriting, the same handwriting she used for the temperature records and the financial accounts and the lists of what needed doing each week. She wrote them down because writing things down was how she made them real, how she moved them from the uncertain space of promises and intentions into the solid record of what had been committed to. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had slept in 2 months. The courthouse in Millbrook Hollow was a modest wooden building on the main street of town, broad enough to serve as a church on Sundays and a meeting hall when the county needed one, and a court of law when Judge Vorsted rode his circuit. It had 4 rows of benches on each side of a center aisle, a raised platform at the front, where the judge sat behind a plain wooden table, and windows on 3 sides that let in enough light in the mornings to read by without a lamp. Marin arrived early with Ingrid and Otto. She wore her cleanest dress, still faded, still patched at the elbows from 2 seasons of hard use. She had braided her hair with the careful attention she gave to things that represented her in public. Her hands were still marked by the work of the past weeks, the calluses at the base of each finger, the healed blisters on her palms, the particular way her grip had changed from weeks of holding tools. She did not try to hide these things. They were part of what she had come to present. Ingrid held her right hand. Otto held her left. They had not let go since the cabin. Clifford Dawes was already there with his lawyer, a thin man from St. Paul, who wore a tobacco smell and an air of professional certainty that Marin recognized as the performance of a man who was paid to seem more confident than the facts warranted. They sat at the front on the left side, their backs to the door, Dawes with his expensive coat folded over the bench beside him, and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who expects to win. Sheriff Pruitt stood near the wall to the right of the platform. He looked at Marin when she entered and gave her a small nod of the kind that means nothing legally but means something personally. The nod of a man who is doing his job and hoping it comes out in a way he can live with. Judge Vorsted entered from a side door at precisely 9 o'clock. He was 65 years old, a Norwegian who had come to Minnesota as a young man and had spent 40 years on this land, farming it first, and then serving it in the capacity the county had asked of him. He had the look of someone who had seen a great deal of human difficulty and had not been made cynical by it, which was rarer than it should have been. "This hearing will determine the disposition of the Lindquist property," he said. He meant Halverson. He corrected himself without embarrassment. "The Halverson property. Mr. Dawes claims default on a debt of $47. Mrs. Halverson has petitioned for continued residency under the Homestead Act widow provision. We will hear both sides." Dawes's lawyer stood and spoke for 12 minutes. His argument was clean and organized in the way that legal arguments are clean and organized when the facts are simple and the law is clear. The debt existed. It was documented. It had not been paid. Furthermore, Mrs. Halverson had operated an unlicensed commercial mill on property encumbered by outstanding debt which demonstrated either ignorance of the applicable statutes or willful disregard for them, neither of which recommended her as a competent manager of a homestead claim. He sat down. Judge Vorstead looked at Marin. "Mrs. Halverson, how do you respond?" She stood. Ingrid and Otto released her hands. "Your Honor," she said, "I do not have $47, but I have something else." "And what is that proof?" she said. She turned to face the back of the room. "Under the Homestead Act provision for widows, I petition for continued residency based on demonstrated improvements and demonstrated ability to work the claim. I call my witnesses." She looked at the door. It opened. Bertha Lindquist came in first. She moved with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had decided before she got out of bed that morning exactly how this day was going to go, and was simply walking through the steps of it. Behind her came her husband, moving more slowly, his face carrying the expression of a man who had revised his opinion of several things in the past few weeks and was still in the process of settling into the revisions. Then the Nilsons. Then the Jensens with their infant daughter who had been sick in October. The baby sleeping against her mother's shoulder, with the particular boneless piece of an infant who does not know what a courthouse is. Then the Andersons who had not used the mill but came anyway. Then family after family filing through the door in the quiet order of people who had decided to be present for something that mattered, who had arranged their farms and their children and their morning work to allow for this, who had made the choice that Marin had asked them to make and were now enacting it. 14 families, 41 people. The benches filled. Then the standing space along the walls filled. The room became warm with the combined presence of 41 people who had come of their own will, which is a different kind of warmth than the warmth of a building. Marin watched Dawes. She watched him the way she had watched the gear teeth when she tested the lantern gear for the first time, looking for the engagement the moment when the mechanism produced its result. His face started with careful neutrality and moved through calculation, and arrived somewhere she did not have a word for, somewhere between recognition and the beginning of understanding that a particular version of events was not going to be the version that held. His lawyer leaned toward him and said something. Dawes shook his head slightly. Bertha spoke first. "Your Honor," she said, standing in the center aisle with the directness of someone who has been waiting for the appropriate moment to say what she has known for some time. "In the past 3 weeks, Mrs. Halverson has ground over 600 pounds of grain for this community. She built a working water mill with her own hands following designs left by her late husband. She charges half the toll of the Halverson mill. She has saved every family in this room days of travel they could not afford to lose." She paused. "She built this while she was grieving," the old woman said. "She built it alone. And it works." She sat down. Mr. Nilsen stood. His wife had baked bread for the first time in 3 months because of Mrs. Halverson's mill. They had not been able to afford the Halverson trip. Their children had been eating oat porridge for weeks before she opened the mill. Mrs. Jensen stood, her infant daughter shifting in her arms. Her baby had been sick in September. She could not leave for 4 days. Mrs. Halverson had ground their wheat so she could stay home with her child. One by one they stood. The Anderson family had not used the mill, but they had seen the flour it produced, had eaten bread made from it at a neighbor's table, and they could testify to its quality. The Ericksons had made the 4-day trip to Halverson twice a year for 11 years. The first time they used Mrs. Halverson's mill, their oldest daughter had cried when she saw how close they had been living to a solution they had not known was available. Old Mr. Sorensen, who was 78 and had farmed his 40 acres since before this valley had a proper road, stood and said simply that in all his years on this land, he had never seen a woman do what Maren Halverson had done, and he had seen women do a great deal. Judge Vorsted listened. He did not look at his papers while the witnesses spoke. He looked at the witnesses themselves, at the faces of people who were saying things they believed, because they had seen them with their own eyes. Not the performed conviction of people who had been coached, but the straightforward directness of people reporting on experience. He had been sitting behind this table for 20 years, and he knew the difference. When the last witness finished, the room was quiet. The judge looked at Dawes. "Mr. Dawes, the law provides that a creditor who purchases debt with the specific intention of forcing foreclosure for personal gain may have his claim challenged on the grounds of bad faith." He set down his pen. "It appears that Mrs. Halverson has demonstrated not only ability to work her claim, but has become a resource this community depends on. The testimony I have heard today suggests that removing her from this land would cause material harm to her neighbors beyond the simple loss of a single property." Dawes's lawyer started to rise. The judge looked at him. The lawyer sat back down. "I am ordering a 6-month stay on collection," Judge Vorsted said. "Mrs. Halverson will make monthly payments of $8 until the debt is satisfied. The mill may continue operating under a provisional permit. Upon full repayment of the debt, the permit will be made permanent and the property deed will be cleared." He struck the table once with his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The room began to move with the particular motion of a gathering that has reached its conclusion. People turning to each other. The low sound of voices that had been held quiet through the proceedings. Maren stood at the center of it still, while the motion happened around her. Ingrid reached her first and took her hand. Then Otto appeared from somewhere and pressed himself against her side, and she put her arm around him without thinking, the automatic shelter that was what grandmothers did. Bertha came through the crowd. She did not say anything. She took Maren's free hand and held it for a moment. The grip of one woman who has survived a great deal, communicating something to another woman in the process of surviving her own great deal. Then she released it and went to speak to her husband. Maren looked at the front of the room. Clifford Dawes was standing with his lawyer, the two of them in conversation. Dawes with his coat over his arm and his face doing the work of reorganizing around an outcome he had not prepared for. He glanced at her once. She met his eyes and held them. He looked away first. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular quality of having come through something, which is different from triumph, which is less loud and more durable. She felt the solid fact of the wheel standing at the creek bend of the gears in their housing of the stones, waiting for the sluice gate to open. She felt the 6 months of payments ahead of her, $8 each 33 days of grinding at current rates to produce the first one manageable plan for the mathematics clear. She took Ingrid and Otto outside into the October morning. The sky was cloudless, the air cold and clean, the kind of Minnesota October morning that reminds you why people came to this country and stayed in it despite everything it asked of them. The street was busy with the ordinary traffic of a market day, wagons and horses and people attending to their errands with the purposeful efficiency of people who have a great deal to do and limited daylight to do it in. She rode home. The sluice gate opened on the morning after the hearing, and the wheel turned again. Maren stood at the lever and pulled it with the same motion she had used on the first test day when Berta had cried, and her husband had reached out to touch the flower in its trough, and the wheel groaned, and then found its rhythm and the gears clicked, and the stones turned and the morning work began. Ingrid was at the hopper. Otto had his broom. The business of the weeks that followed had a different quality than the business of the 9 days before the cease and desist order. Word had spread further now, carried by the 41 people who had come to the courthouse and by the people they had told afterward. And the farmers who arrived with their grain wagons carried with them the knowledge of what had happened in the Millbrook Hollow courthouse, the story of the widow who had built the mill, and the neighbors who had stood up in the wooden building on Main Street to say what they knew. Some of them said they had been meaning to come before. Some said they had heard the mill was good and wanted to judge for themselves. All of them left with flour, and with the arithmetic of the saved trip calculated in their heads, 4 days of travel replaced by 1 morning at the creek. And the difference between those 2 numbers was the thing they told their neighbors. The debt payments went in on schedule. $8 the first month, $8 the second, $8 the third. Maren recorded each payment in the journal with the date and the amount. The same systematic recording she had maintained since the first day of construction. She did not allow herself to calculate how many payments remained until she was 3 months in, and then the calculation was simple, and its result was satisfying in the spare way that accurate arithmetic is always satisfying. She also repaired the fence lines. Gunnar had always walked the fence lines in spring to check for winter damage, and she had watched him do it enough times to know. His method, the slow, systematic attention he gave to every post and every wire, the way he noted problems and returned to address them in order of severity. She walked them in the November light with the same attention, Ingrid beside her carrying the repair supplies, and she found 3 sections that needed work, and did the work herself with Arvid's guidance on the 2 joints that required the technique she had not yet learned. Arvid had stayed longer than the original arrangement. He had stayed because there was work, and because the work interested him, and because Berta had told him in terms that were more direct than diplomatically advisable, that the Halverson place would benefit from a reliable young man with good hands, through at least the first winter of Maren's management of it alone. He had said he would stay through spring through planting, and they would see what was needed after that. Maren paid him from the mill earnings. She paid him fairly, which meant she paid him what she would have paid any other skilled worker for the same quality of work, not less, because he was doing her a favor, and not more because she felt the weight of owing gratitude. This was how she had operated her whole life, and she saw no reason to operate differently now. On a gray November morning, 8 days after the 6th hearing, Clifford Dawes came down the county road. He came alone. No lawyer, no foreman, no companion to manage the social dimensions of what he was doing. He rode to the mill shed and dismounted, which she noticed because he had never dismounted before on her property in all the times he had come to speak at her from the height of his saddle. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked to where she was standing at the sluice lever. He was carrying nothing when he arrived. His wagon was on the road loaded. She could see it from where she stood. Mrs. Halverson, Mr. Dawes. A pause in which both of them waited to see who would establish the terms. He said, "I have 300 pounds of grain." He said it the way you say a fact that has been stripped of all its surrounding context. The fact alone without the performance that had accompanied every previous statement he had made to her on her land. My hands cannot keep up with the grinding by hand. The cattle need feed processed before the ground freezes hard. Maren said nothing. She waited. "The trip to Halverson takes 4 days," he said. "I do not have 4 days." He reached into his coat and produced coins. "The toll is 1/16," he said. "I will pay in advance." She counted the coins. Correct amount. She put them in her apron pocket. "Bring your grain," she said. He went to the wagon. He began carrying sacks to the shed entrance without asking for help, without directing anyone else to do it, without the managed ease of a man accustomed to having his lifting done for him. He was 60 years old, and the work of carrying grain sacks showed in his face, but he carried them without complaint. Trip after trip from the wagon to the shed, and he set each one down in the order. She indicated with a nod. Ingrid adjusted the hopper for the grain type. The wheel turned. The gears clicked. The stones made their sound. Dawes stood to one side while the grinding ran. He watched the stones and the gears and the belt and the connection to the wheel with the specific attention of a man who had believed something was a folly and was now revising that belief in real time, looking at the evidence of the revision with an expression she recognized as the expression of someone doing honest accounting. After a while, he said, "Your husband designed this?" "Yes." He was quiet for a longer while. The wheel turned. The flour collected in the trough. He was a skilled man, Dawes said. He was, she said. The grinding took the morning. When the last sack was done and the flour was bagged and the weights confirmed against the toll calculation, Dawes loaded his wagon with the efficiency of a man who had been doing physical work all his life, regardless of what his coat cost. He mounted his horse. He sat there for a moment without speaking. His horse shifted and he stilled it. Then he said, without turning to face her, the words directed at the road ahead of him, or at the distance, or at some audience she could not see. "You proved me wrong. I believed a woman in your position could not do what you have done. I said it publicly. I was wrong." He did not wait for a response. He rode east toward his ranch with the 300 pounds of ground feed in his wagon. Maren stood at the mill shed entrance and watched him go until the road was empty. She looked at the wheel. The wheel turned with its patient revolution, the paddles lifting and dropping through the current, the water giving its energy to the shaft, and through the shaft to the gears, and through the gears to the stones, and through the stones to the grain that was already waiting in the hopper for the next customer who would come down the county road with a loaded wagon and an arithmetic problem that the creek had already solved. "Gunner," she said. She said it quietly, the way she sometimes said things that were meant to travel further than the immediate air around her. Then she went back to work. The first real snow came in December, light at first, and then heavier. The kind of snow that settles into the landscape with the seriousness of something intending to stay. The creek did not freeze at the bend where the water ran fastest. The wheel kept turning through the cold, the paddles shedding ice from their surfaces on each revolution, the spray catching the winter light and falling back into the dark water below. Maren had insulated the mill shed with the method Arvid had shown her, the space between the inner and outer walls packed with sawdust from the shed floor and dry grass from the harvested fields. The stones generated their own warmth through friction, a modest warmth that kept the interior of the shed above, freezing even in the worst cold enough to keep the gears from stiffening enough to keep the belt from cracking. She had recorded the temperature inside the shed every morning since November. The same habit of observation that had produced 9 journals of farm data. The same conviction that understanding what was happening required first paying attention to it. The payments went in on schedule. $8 in November, $8 in December, $8 in January, on a February afternoon with the sun low and the snow on the ground. reflecting the light in the way that made a Minnesota February look briefly like something you would choose rather than something you endured. A wagon came down the county road that Maren did not recognize. A young woman drove it. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired with a set to her jaw that Maren recognized as the set of a jaw that has been keeping its owner upright through something difficult. In the wagon bed were 2 sacks of grain. She drove up to the mill shed and climbed down. First time Maren asked, the young woman looked at her. Yes, my husband died in October. Everyone says I should sell the claim and move to town. They say a woman alone cannot. Cannot what Maren said. The young woman stopped. She looked at Maren properly for the first time at the calloused hands and the repaired dress and the face that had been through things and had come through them and looked like it. I am Sybil Thorvald, she said. Maren Halverson. She took Sybil's grain to the hopper and set the feed herself, adjusting for the variety of winter wheat she had been seeing more of as the season progressed. She pulled the lever. The wheel took the creek's energy and gave it to the stones. While they waited, she told Sybil about the wheel. Not the way she had told the story to the judge. The legal version organized around evidence and provision. The other version, Gunner finding the creek and measuring its flow in the summers. The stones under the tarp. The drawings in the notebook and the line he had written at the bottom of the last diagram. The 33 days of building with blistered hands. The first flower in the trough and Bertha's tears. And after she said, the cease and desist the petition. The 41 people in the courthouse. Sybil listened. Her jaw was still set, but her eyes had changed. How did you know it would work? Sybil asked. Maren thought about this. I did not know, she said. Not at first. But my husband had planned it carefully. I trusted his planning. And then when the planning became building and the building became the thing itself, I trusted the thing. She gestured at the wheel. You can look at a drawing and have doubts. It is harder to doubt a wheel you can see turning. Sybil looked at the wheel for a moment. What if I do not have what you had? She said. A design. A plan someone left for me. Maren looked at her steadily. You have what you know, she said. Everyone has something they know that other people need. Something they can do or make or provide that the people around them cannot get elsewhere, or cannot get as easily, or cannot get for a price they can afford. My husband knew water. I knew how to read his plans. What do you know? Sybil was quiet for a while. I know seeds, she said finally. My father was a seedsman in Sweden. I grew up sorting and storing and knowing which varieties survive which winters. I have been saving seed for 6 years. Maren nodded. Then there are farmers in this valley who would pay for seed selected by someone who knows what they are selecting for, rather than simply saving from last year's crop and hoping. The flour was ready. Maren weighed it and calculated the toll and bagged it. Sybil paid her portion without comment, the transaction of 2 working women. At the wagon, Sybil stopped. She looked at the wheel again. My mother used to say something she said. In Swedish. It means the water does not rest. So why should you wear yourself out when the river can do the work? Maren looked at her. It means, Sybil said, find a smarter way. Yes, Maren said. It means exactly that. She stood at the mill shed entrance and watched Sybil's wagon turn onto the county road and head north. Then she went back inside. Ingrid was at the hopper adjusting the feed for the next customer's grain. Otto was sweeping the floor with his careful broom strokes, the accumulation of flour and chaff that built up between grindings removed with the same concentrated attention he had applied to this task since October. Maren sat at the small table in the corner of the shed, the table where she kept the journal and the pencil and the account book. She opened the journal to the current page. She wrote the date, February 1888. She wrote the temperature inside the shed and outside it. She wrote the names of the customers who had come that week, and the amounts they had brought, and the toll she had collected. She wrote the account balance and the amount of the next payment, and the date it was due. Then she looked at the entry for the day she had found the notebook. October, day 1. 2 millstones under a tarp. Gunner's drawings. His line at the bottom of the last diagram. When this wheel turns, you will never need anyone's permission again. She had read that line many times since October. She had read it in the early mornings when she needed to remember what she was building toward, and in the difficult evenings when the work had gone wrong, and she needed to remember why she was continuing. She had read it in the courthouse when she was waiting for Judge Vorstead to finish writing his order, and she needed something to hold on to that was not in the room. She had understood it as a promise about money and independence, and the specific freedom that comes from a property that can support itself. She had understood it as Gunner's gift to her, the practical gift of a man who expressed love through planning and building, rather than through the softer currencies of sentiment. But sitting in the warm mill shed in February with her grandchildren working beside her, and the wheel turning and the flour collecting in its trough, and the account book showing a balance that would clear the debt by April, she understood it differently. The permission he meant was not permission from Clifford Dawes, or from Judge Vorstead, or from the law, or from the neighbors, or from any of the external authorities that people spend their lives navigating. It was not the permission that other people grant or withhold. It was the permission you give yourself. The permission to do the thing that the numbers say can be done. The permission to trust the plan, even when the plan has not yet become the thing. The permission to keep working when the working is difficult and the outcome is uncertain, and the world around you has offered you a more comfortable alternative. She had given herself that permission at the kitchen table in October, when she decided not to open the $12 envelope and not to ride to the train station. She had given it to herself again at 3 in the morning when the gear blank came out wrong for the second time, and she sat in the shed with sawdust in her hair and a lantern running low and decided to build the jig instead of making a third attempt with the old method. She had given it to herself standing at the fence line, watching Clifford Dawes ride away on the morning he told her she had 60 days. The wheel did not give her that permission. Gunner's drawings did not give her that permission. The law and the judge and the 41 people in the courthouse did not give her that permission. She had given it to herself. Gunner had simply built her a wheel to turn once she had. Outside, the February afternoon was settling toward evening. The light through the shed windows had gone to the low gold of late day. The creek ran under the wheel with its constant sound. Ingrid was telling Otto something about the hopper feed rate, explaining it with the matter-of-fact patience of a 9-year-old who has learned a thing and is transferring the small, intimate pedagogy of children working beside each other toward a shared purpose. Maren closed the account book. She put on her coat and walked outside to stand at the creek bank. The wheel turned in the last light. The paddles lifted water and let it fall, lifted and fell. The motion that had been repeating since October. And that would repeat, she intended, for many years more. The creek ran through the bare valley in the February cold, with the same energy it had carried through the October warmth and the December snow. The same energy it would carry through the spring thaw and the summer heat, and the next October and all the Octobers after that. She stood and watched the wheel for a while. Then she went back inside to finish the day's work. The account book was balanced. The grain was ground. The toll was stored. The payments were on schedule. The fence lines were walked. The children were fed and warm, and learning things beside her that she had not known she would have the occasion to teach them. The creek did not rest, neither did she.